History of Russia. The history of Russia is the period that begins with the settlement of the Eastern Slavs, from whom the Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians later emerged. The first Eastern Slavic state was Kievan Rus, which received Christianity from the Eastern Roman Empire in 988. In this way, Russian culture was created, which during the next 1,000 years was a mixture of Byzantine and Old Slavic culture. Kievan Rus ceased to exist as a state in the 1330s. Century, due to the Mongol invasion. During this period, cities such as Novgorod and Pskov preserved the cultural and political heritage of Kievan Rus. After the 13th century, Moscow slowly began to dominate other cultural centers. By the 18th century, the Grand Duchy of Muscovy had grown into the Great Russian Empire, which stretched from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east. Territorial expansions to the west enabled a better connection of Russia with the rest of Europe, whose influence led to the creation of a climate in which the implementation of comprehensive reforms was demanded. The government responded to these aspirations with a combination of repression and hesitant reforms. Russian serfs were freed from 1861, but the conditions under which they were freed were unfavorable for the peasants and only accelerated the revolution. From the liberation of the serfs until the beginning of the First World War in 1914, with the implementation of the Stoplin reforms, the adoption of the Constitution in 1906 and the decisions made by the Duma, significant changes were made in the politics and economy of Russia, but the Tsar was still not willing to give up the autocratic way rule. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was the logical consequence of a combination of complete economic collapse, anti-war mood and disagreement with autocratic rule. Liberals and moderate socialists initially took power, but their failure to implement their own policies led to the October Revolution when the Bolshevik communists took power. Between 1922 and 1991, Russia was part of the Soviet Union. Progress in creating a socialist society during the various periods of the history of the Soviet Union was variable, from a mixed economy and diverse society during the 1920s. Through the tightly managed economy and political repression during the Stalin era to the age of stagnation during the 80s. Beginning in March 1918, the social order in the Soviet Union was based on a one-party communist system. By the end of the 80s, the weakening and decline of the Soviet political and economic system became more and more noticeable. The leaders of the Soviet Union tried to prevent its further decline, but this was only a prelude to its final collapse. With the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, Russia became an independent country and was recognized as the legal successor of the Soviet Union. Russia lost its superpower status and faced serious challenges in trying to establish a new political and economic system. The idea of a socialist planned economy and state ownership was abandoned, and the economy began to develop on the principles of market capitalism, which very often produced unwanted results. In Russia, even today, the influence of both the monarchical and the Soviet past is felt in almost all spheres of society. Pre-Slavic era. During prehistory, the vast steppes of southern Russia were inhabited by numerous nomadic tribes. In ancient times, this territory was known as Scythia. Archaeological remains of the people who lived in this area were found during the 20th century. At the end of the 8th century BC. Along the northern coasts of the Black and Azov Seas, the Greeks founded a large number of colonies, among which the largest were in Tanais and Phanagoria. The Bosphorus kingdom, which arose from Greek colonies, suffered several barbarian invasions between the 3rd and 6th centuries. During the 8th century, a Turkic tribe, the Tsars, ruled the steppes of the lower Volga basin, between the Caspian and Black Seas. They were important allies of the Byzantine Empire and led a series of successful wars against the Arabs. In the 8th century they received Judaism. Early Eastern Slavs. The ancestors of the Russians were ancient Slavic tribes whose ancestral home, according to the claims of some scientists, was the wooded area around the Pripyat swamp. Eastern Slavs have been living in the eastern part of Europe for several thousand years. One part lived and now lives from Kiev to today's Suzdal and Murom, and another that lived and still lives today from Polotsk to Novgorod and Rostov. From the 7th century Eastern Slavs were the majority population in western Russia and they slowly and peacefully assimilated the Finno-Ugric tribes. Kievan Rus. The Varangians, Vikings, first settled in the area of Lake Ladoga, and then moved further south to Novgorod. They were engaged in piracy and trade. In the middle of the 9th century, They began to move along the waterways from the eastern Baltic towards the Caspian and Black Seas. According to the legend, which is described in the chronicle called The Tale of Past Summers, Prince Rurik of Varas was chosen as the ruler of Novgorod, sometime around 860. His successors extended their rule to the south by capturing Kiev, which had previously been ruled by the Tsars. The first Russian state, Kievan Rus, emerged in the 9th century in the Dnieper River Valley. The trading interests of the cities led to their unification under the rule of Kiev, as the cities sought to provide security for their ships that maintained trade links between Scandinavia and Byzantium. In this way, Kievan Rus took control of the routes for the transport of hides, wax and slaves along the Dnieper and Volkhov rivers. By the end of the 10th century, the minority Varangians were almost completely assimilated by the majority Slavs. During their numerous expeditions to Constantinople, they came into contact with Greek culture. The Kievan Rus created a Slavic variant of Orthodox Christianity, thus deepening the synthesis of Byzantine and Slavic culture, which would characterize Russian culture for the next 1,000 years. Christianity was officially accepted in 988 by the act of public baptism of the inhabitants of Kiev, which was carried out by order of Vladimir I. A few years after that, the first code of law, Russian justice, was proclaimed. The rulers of Kiev followed the example of the Byzantine rulers, to keep the church in a dependent position, so throughout history in Russia, church and state have always been closely linked. In the 11th century, and especially during the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus experienced a boom in economy, architecture and literary creativity. The nomadic Turkic people, the Cumans, conquered southern Russia at the end of the 11th century and created a nomadic state on the coast of the Black Sea. They first wrote Pechenegs from that area. The Cumans made constant raids to the north, where they looted and burned Russian villages. The population from that area began to move north en masse. The rapid weakening of Kievan Rus was influenced by internal dynastic struggles over the throne. The weakening of Kiev was also reflected in other Russian states, Vladimir Suzdal, Novgorod Republic, and Galician Russia. The conquests of the Mongol Golden Horde in the 13th century dealt the final blow to Kievan Rus, which ceased to exist. Galician Russia was annexed to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Vladimir Suzdal was under Mongol administration, while only the Novgorod Republic preserved its independence. Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion accelerated the disintegration of Kievan Rus. After the battle on the Kalka River in 1223, in which the Russians and Mongols clashed, the Mongols recorded a great victory. During 1237 and 1238, they burned the city of Vladimir and other major cities of northeastern Russia after the battle on the Sid River, in which they won again after that. They turned to the west, towards Poland and Hungary. They conquered most of the Russian states, only the Novgorod Republic escaped destruction and preserved its independence within the Hanseatic League. The consequences of the Mongol invasion were enormous. About half of the population of Russia died in the attack. The biggest cultural centers were completely destroyed. Cities like Kiev and Vladimir never recovered from the destruction. Refugees who left southern Russia mostly settled in the area between the Volga and Oka. It is a region that was the core of medieval Russia. New cities such as Moscow, Tver and Nizhny Novgorod began to fight each other for supremacy. Regardless of the Russian victory in the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, the Russian territories remained under Mongol rule until 1480. The Golden Horde. After the collapse of the Khazar state in the 10th century, the non-Slavic state of Podvolska Bulgaria emerged in the area of the Middle Volga. Soon after that, its inhabitants accepted Islam. After the Mongol invasion, it became part of the Golden Horde, and from them arose today's Chuvash and Kazan Tatars. The Mongols ruled Russia from their western capital at Sarai on the Volga River, near present-day Volgograd, which at the time was one of the largest cities in the world. The princes of southern and eastern Russia had to pay tribute to the Mongols, who were often referred to as Tatars, and in return they received powers on the basis of which they could act as emissaries of the Khans. In essence, the princes had great freedom to rule according to their will, but they were still obliged to receive confirmation of their title from the Tatar Khan. The Tatars left all privileges to the Russian Orthodox Church, did not persecute it, and even the clergy were exempted from paying taxes. Prince of Novgorod, Alexander Nevsky, gained hero status in the middle of the 13th century thanks to his victories over the Teutonic Knights, the Swedes and the Lithuanians. In 1237, Pope Gregory IX organized a crusade to conquer the Russian lands. The Orthodox Church and the princes saw a greater danger in the west than in the Mongols. Nevsky received protection and help from the Mongols in the fight against invaders from the west who, in the hope of benefiting from the collapse of Russia after the Mongol invasion, attacked their territory. Despite this, the heirs of Nevsky would later rise up against the Tatar government. The Mongols had a great influence on Russian military tactics and contributed to the development of trade routes. Under Mongol rule, Russia developed a network of postal routes, increased population growth, developed a fiscal system and a strong military organization. The Eastern influence would remain strong until the 17th century, when Russian rulers sought to organize the country according to the Western model. Grand Duchy of Moscow. Danilo Alexandrovich, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, founded the Principality of Moscow, which was still known as Muscovy, which later completely expelled the Tatars from Russia. At first, the Principality of Moscow was in a vassal relationship with Vladimir. That later she managed to annex Vladimir. An important factor in the rise of the Moscow Principality was the cooperation of their rulers with the Mongol rulers, who confirmed the title of Grand Duke and gave them the right to collect taxes from other Russian states on their behalf. The supremacy of Moscow in relation to other Russian states was confirmed by the fact that the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church was moved there. The metropolitan seat was first moved from Kiev to Vladimir in 1299, and a few years later it was moved permanently to Moscow. By the middle of the 14th century, the power of the Mongols was declining and the Grand Duke was able to openly oppose them. In Kulikov on the Don in 1380, they recorded a difficult victory. It did not mark the end of the Mongol rule in Russia, but it brought glory to the Grand Duke Dmitry Donskoy. Moscow's leadership in Russia was completely consolidated, and the territory was significantly expanded in the middle of the 14th century through negotiations, war and marriages. Ivan III the Great. In the 15th century, the Grand Duke began to unite the Russian lands under his rule. The most responsible for this process was Ivan III, 1462–1505, 39, who laid the foundations of Russia as a nation-state. He fought against the Principality of Lithuania for supremacy over the semi-independent principalities located in the upper reaches of the Dnieper and Oka rivers. By winning part of the nobility from other Russian states to his side, minor border conflicts and a long war against Novgorod, Ivan III managed to annex Novgorod and Tver to the Moscow Principality. 44. Ivan III tripled the territory of Russia during his reign. 39. During his conflict with Pskov, the monk Philidius handed him a letter that contained a prophecy that his country would become the Third Rome. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 only contributed to the popularization of this idea that Moscow could become the new Roman seat of orthodoxy. Ivan III consolidated his absolutist rule. He refused to pay tribute to the Tatars and with a series of attacks paved the way for the complete destruction of the Golden Horde, which disintegrated into several smaller khanates and hordes. He began the construction of a defensive belt to protect the southern borders from the Crimean Tatars and other hordes. The implementation of the country's internal consolidation was accompanied by further territorial expansion. By the 16th century, the Muscovite rulers had put the territory of all of Russia under their control. The numerous principalities that retained some elements of independence were forced to recognize Ivan III and his descendants as supreme rulers, with complete control over the army, judiciary and foreign policy. Russian rulers began to bear the title of emperor, and the first crowned emperor was Ivan IV the Terrible. Ivan IV the Terrible. The development of the imperial autocracy reached its peak in the period between 1547 to 1584, during the time of Ivan the Terrible. His maternal grandmother was Serbian, Princess Anna Yakshich-Glinska, from the famous Serbian noble family Yakshich, whose sister was Serbian despot Jelena, wife of Serbian despot Jovan Brankovic. Ivan the Terrible strengthened his position as an absolutist ruler, who subjected all the nobility to his will, punishing with exile and death those who showed the slightest sign of disobedience. Despite this, many historians consider him a great statesman, who reformed Russia by passing a new code, establishing the first representative body of the Land Assembly in 1550, suppressing the influence of the clergy and establishing local governments in rural parts of the country. Ivan the Terrible suffered a defeat in the Livonian War, which he led in order to achieve complete control over the Baltic coast and the ports that would enable him to develop maritime trade. He managed to annex the Khanate of Kazan, Astrakhan and Siberia to Russia. These conquests prevented the migration of warlike nomadic tribes from Asia to Europe, via the Volga and the Urals. After those territorial expansions, a large number of Tatar Muslims found themselves within the Russian borders, thus Russia became a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state. He encouraged the migration of Russian Cossacks who made the first settlements in Siberia and thus began its colonization. In the last years of his reign, he seduces the new regime, by creating a new institution called the Oprichnina, which represents a kind of his personal bodyguard whose task is to protect him and fight against traitors. His followers carried out several large-scale purges of the feudal aristocracy, which was suspected of treason after the escape of Prince Kurbsky to Lithuania. These purges reached their peak in 1570 when the Novgorod massacre took place. All this, along with the weakening of the army, epidemics and poor harvest yields, led to the complete weakening of the Russian Empire, which allowed the Crimean Tatars to devastate central Russia and completely burn Moscow. He dissolved the Oprichnina in 1572. At the end of the reign of Ivan the Terrible, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance and Sweden launched a joint attack on Russia and completely devastated its northern and northwestern regions. An age of unrest. After the death of Ivan the Terrible, his son Fyodor I came to the throne. Since Fyodor had no children, and his brother Dmitry I died in 1591 under unexplained circumstances, the Ryurikovich dynasty was extinguished, and Boris Godunov came to the throne. The end of the Ryurikovich dynasties marks the beginning of a period of civil wars and foreign interference in the country's internal affairs, known in history as the Troubled Times. The very cold summers of 1601, 1602–1603 caused poor harvest yields, leading to great famine and mass unrest. Part of the nobility did not agree with the election of Boris Godunov as the new ruler. The appearance of a young man who claimed to be Tsarevich Dmitry I gave the Polish-Lithuanian alliance the opportunity to bring the false Dmitry I to the throne with the help of a dissatisfied part of the nobility, and later to place his prince Vladislav IV Vasa on the Russian throne. The Polish invasion led to a complete unification of the people and an uprising against the invaders. In the fall of 1612, the People's Army, led by Kosma Minyan and Dmitry Posharsky, liberated Moscow. Regardless of the liberation, a large part of the territory lost during the Troubled Times remained under the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in Sweden.